The following video contains fairly major spoilers for Oyasumi Punpun and Linebarrels of Iron, along with prominently featuring scenes from Evangelion, A Silent Voice, and Uncut Gems. Wherever possible without breaking the flow of the video, I've placed timestamps to let you skip major spoilers, along with a little label in the corner of the screen. The video also contains references to sexual abuse in its second chapter, as well as mentions of suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. It also includes a large amount of my own personal takes and analysis. That much is inevitable. Shinji Ikari is pathetic. If you clicked on this video, it's likely that, whether through having seen the series yourself or having picked up on EVA discussion through cultural osmosis, you're at the very least familiar with this idea. The debate has been had many times over on EVA's themes, the meaning behind almost every scene, and Shinji's character as representative of a gifted child, with far too much pressure placed on his shoulders at a point in a kid's life that's already hard enough to deal with on its own. These discussions are perhaps only outshined by best girl arguments, which have been going for nearly 30 godforsaken years. But these things aren't going to be the focus of this video. Thousands of people have analyzed every minute detail this show has to offer, and thousands more will do it all over again after I'm done with this video. Instead, whether you see Shinji the way he and many around him see him, namely as a failure, or whether you sympathize with him as someone in way over his head, not by his own choice but due to the pressures of the life that was forced upon him, I want you to agree for a moment to a premise. The premise that he is pathetic. Punpun is pathetic. This point is one which gets a lot less dissent from people who have read through the manga. Punpun as a character is very intentionally, obviously, and bluntly a loser. Whatever chance in his life is granted to him, he squanders it as a result of his own anxieties, toxic behavior, and lingering trauma he refuses to face head-on, all the while idealizing a life he would lead if only he were to be with his childhood's beloved Aiko. As much as some people see him as relatable, as representative of the reader's own anxieties, whether we overcome them or not, at his core, Punpun is by no means a hero, he too is pathetic. And finally, Kouchi Hayase from Linebarrels of Iron. This is the example with which I'm likely to lose the largest chunk of the audience, but I ask that you stick with me here since he's fairly important to what I want to talk about. There is very little debate on the fact that Hayase is pathetic, in part because it's extremely hard to argue against him being an irritating, worthless, and hard-to-like character in the show's opening episodes, and in part because Linebarrels of Iron never saw all too much success. The first point was in large part responsible for the second. But let's not get stuck in the weeds just yet. The purpose of this video is to not just look at what exactly makes these characters, as I described them, pathetic, but to specifically look at what kind of audience response these characters had garnered, what made it so, what does it tell us about ourselves, and what having characters like these allows a writer to do that they couldn't with any other archetype. These three represent more than just three different circumstances within their respective worlds, or just three different genres, but also three different contexts in which the world was made and what their authors had to say about these worlds and these characters. And while they all evoke a mixture of different feelings from viewers, I'll be using each one of them to focus on a single one over the rest. Pity, regret, hate. When discussing characters such as these, a central role has to be given to pity. You often can't help but to some degree feel bad for these characters, especially ones put into their positions by force, or by their own mistakes, or not knowing any better, perhaps not believing that they deserve any better. Few things remain to be said about Shinji that don't seem redundant by now. The way the adults in his life push their visions for the future onto him, not taking into account his own wants, his own likes and dislikes. Most of us have been there on some level, and know what it's like, being made to go along with whatever the people in control of our lives tell us to do. Nothing to me feels as emblematic of that as the dance lesson sequence. Shinji and Asuka are made to learn how to work together, again, for the sake of piloting their EVAs for the benefit of the adults in charge, and so they're forced to do so with these dance lessons. And in a bid to not be outdone by the other, they both put full effort into it. They accomplish what has to be done, but for what was supposed to be a bonding exercise, it obviously isn't. From start to finish, the two have little more than contempt for each other. And yet they're made to play nice. It's something a lot of us have gone through at some point, being made to make friends with the neighbor's kids or classmates or outright bullies for the sake of not causing more problems for our parents or teachers. No matter how much you might have despised that other person, or not even despised them at all, you were pushed together because it made sense not to you, but to the people around you. As much as the joke of Shinji needing to get into the damn robot has gone around, to the point where it's now been completely trampled into the dirt, Shinji doesn't really fight going into the EVA, no more than most people in his position would. He knows he has to do it, everyone else tells him he has to do it, so what choice does he have? Shinji isn't pathetic just because of his own personal failings, his character flaws, or his ultimate inability to change the course of the show or his life. He's pitiful because he's stripped of his autonomy before the show even kicks off. He's the only one that can really do what the adults need done. He's the only one that can pilot the EVA. If he doesn't, innocent people will die, and someone else will be forced to take his place, only to likely die themselves too. How do you decline when this is presented to you as the alternative, when it seems like the whole world is relying on you? Likewise, how do you take credit for any lives you save or things you accomplish when you never made the choice to do so, and when all you get for having done so is even more responsibility? Even to get a simple congratulations for your deeds, that to Shinji is something he could only imagine in a dream. Shinji and characters like him evoke pity from us because ultimately they're victims, not heroes. Victims to tragedy or the machinations of others, and as much as we idolize those we see as heroes in the real world too, the fact is that not everyone seems that they can be a hero, not naturally at least. Succumbing to tragedy is as human as persevering through it. I struggled to accurately summarize in one word what this section of the video is about. I considered empathy, but it seemed too broad of a term, and the word cringe, while certainly accurate, doesn't quite carry the impact I would hope for. And so I settled on the word regret. Out of the three protagonists I chose at the start of this video, Punpun initially stands out for a single reason. Well, then again, for a start, he never gets a mech, nor does he fight any aliens. And he's also rather distinctly bird-shaped. Out of the three protagonists I chose at the start of this video, Punpun initially stands out for a plethora of reasons, but there's one that matters a lot more here, and that is the fact that we watch Punpun grow up. In fact, while both Shinji and Hayase are known to us only as teenagers, as readers we become intimately familiar with Punpun from his early childhood all the way into his young adult life. Punpun is a tragic character too, but one who isn't quite coerced into his position by those around him, although it is largely due to the actions of his family, his classmates, people he was meant to trust, that he suffers from lingering trauma and self-esteem issues. Those are in the end his own personal demons. Whenever he screws up, whenever he doesn't say what he feels he needs to, or doesn't reach out to those he wants to reach out to, it is a result of that trauma, yes, but as a reader there's a part of you that just wants him to overcome it, to become a hero within his own story, but he never does. To do that, he'd have to really acknowledge the trauma in the first place, and that's not just something Punpun struggles with admitting, even just within the bounds of his own story. Although there are often times when he will lash out against the world and the people within it and blame them all and the cruelty of our society and the world for making his life as empty and miserable as he finds it to be, most of the time he doesn't even allow himself to do that much. In fact, whenever he, or actually any other character within the manga, comes to a prolonged introspective moment, when for just a moment they start to consider the bigger picture of the world as a whole, they dismiss themselves, saying they're in no place to think about things like that. Instead, he blames himself. That he himself is a failure because that's just what he's supposed to be, a failure. Brief moments of hope within him are so often snuffed out, he sees himself as unworthy of even that hope for happiness or love. In that self-hatred, he convinces himself at times that he'll be happy, that he'll be capable of satisfying himself so long as he satisfies some base urges. He doesn't really need love, he needs sexual gratification. That's just biology, he should follow it. An unhealthy attitude again brought on by his trauma, as his first sexual encounter had been at the hands of someone in their most vulnerable moment, taking advantage of him. This is where the video gets explicitly heavy, both in topic and spoilers for the manga. I promise we'll bring it back around once we get to Hayase. The scene in which Midori, the woman who had been like a motherly figure to Punpun for so long and would come to be his aunt, sexually assaults him, leaves him scarred for life. Although, unfortunately, there are still people out there who will try to excuse or justify Midori's actions, much like there are people who do so in the case of real victims. Most luckily agree that what she does is horrible. The most we can do is explain her actions, not excuse them, with how her own toxic relationship and uncertainty had left her so miserable and desperate she would then go on to force herself onto Punpun, to pass further trauma down onto him. After this happens, Punpun comes to naturally despise her while she moves on, or tries to, as though nothing is wrong. I wouldn't linger so much on this scene if it didn't embody within itself and its consequences exactly what this video and this specific chapter is about. Many of us would watch Evangelion and despite empathizing with Shinji, despite pitying him, despite knowing that he is, in the end, a child, there are times when we might still shout at our screens for him to do something, to get in the damn robots, to man up, to fix things, just do something. In Goodnight Punpun, it's no different. Throughout the entire thing, as a reader, for as much as you might relate to him, to his anxieties that he faces, to his worries, you're still likely to recognize the ways in which he could turn things around and plead with this fictional character to just do the right thing. Straying away from the world of manga and anime, another prime example of this sort of reaction comes from Adam Sandler's masterful Uncut Gems, where every scene leading up to the movie's climax left me flabbergasted, unable to understand why Howard just doesn't fix things for once instead of making them worse. But sometimes you just can't. The reader knows how what's happening is wrong on so many different levels, and that Punpun, had he just gathered himself, had he persevered through what was going on, had he made himself recognize what was being done to him as something that needs to stop, he could have... But the truth is, Punpun is painfully aware of all of that, but he's still a kid and he's scared. And he lets it happen. He resists, he wants to say no, he jumps back, but he's manipulated into it, and he regrets it. Naturally, his hatred towards the person who assaulted him, it's understandable why it's there, but to some degree it's also an extension of his self-hatred too, blaming himself for not acting, betraying more than his own trust. Regret is a recurring motif in Goodnight Punpun. Every missed connection, everything left unsaid, everything that was said too much or at the wrong time. During his time in high school, he goes on a date which leads to him attempting to make a move on someone who doesn't reciprocate. For a moment, it seems as though he'd very nearly commit the same heinous act as had been done to him. He doesn't, and yet he's filled with so much regret and so much anxiety, thinking this girl would go out to tell everyone about how horrible he truly is. He winds up shutting himself out for the rest of his high school years. Something he can only come to regret later as an adult, for having wasted all that time. What should have been the best years of his youth. He buries himself in so much self-hatred and so much regret that the only time he truly feels as though he could be happy is when he's literally being someone else. But then, well, let's take a breather. Characters like these that make us feel for just how awful their decisions or lack thereof seem to be, I've presented them as fairly bleak so far and from equally bleak and depressing mediums. That's not always the case, of course. Characters very explicitly doing the exact thing no normal person would ever consider is a fine basis for a comedy after all. and perhaps no series better encapsulates the potential hilarity of a pathetic protagonist than Watamote. I say this with complete and utter self-awareness. Anime is a medium mainly consumed by complete nerds. The stigma has changed, anime has become more acceptable and accessible, but I'd still like to think that if you've reached a level of investment where you'd go beyond the complete mainstream to even pick up works like Watamote and Punpun, you're already likely to relate to the anxieties and social awkwardness these characters embody. There's a reason the alternative title I considered for this chapter was cringe, because that's the exact type of reaction these stories get out of us, just on different levels, for different reasons, and leaving us feeling, well, different. You can cringe at Punpun's poor decision-making skills as much as you can wince at Tomoko's, it's just that the former has me staring blankly at the next chapter option in my browser, while the latter has me not staring at my screen at all, as by that point I had crawled underneath my table, laughing aloud to hide the pain. It's not just that these characters are pathetic in the general sense, they're pathetic in a way in which we almost completely involuntarily see ourselves in. The traditional shonen hero might symbolize the way we'd all like to be, but it's these guys who better symbolize how we sometimes are when we prefer we weren't. In the previous two chapters, I've worked out the assumption that you're likely to at least be somewhat aware of these characters through cultural osmosis, or in the case of Punpun, you'd be able to gauge the general idea from how much I've shown, but with Kurogane no Linebarrels, I recognize that most people would have absolutely no clue what the hell I'm talking about. As such, allow me to lay down for you the overall plot of the first couple of episodes and introduce you to Hayase Kouchi, age 14. A complete loser, introduced to us as a doormat to be taken advantage of by his bullies who use him as an errand boy, his childhood friends constantly having to come to his rescue, only for him to reject even that help out of embarrassment. He doesn't want to be weak and the one that needs to be saved all the time, but unfortunately, he is. Then, on one such routine errand run for his bullies, a giant robot lands on him in the middle of a park, and a magic naked space woman with amnesia from another dimension grants him superpowers and the ability to pilot a giant mecha known as a Linebarrel, along with a great mission to protect the Earth from being subjugated by an evil interdimensional force. To Hayase, all of this is a dream come true. He's literally always dreamed of being a hero, believing there was a righteousness and hidden power within him. To tie it back to what I've said before, Hayase would be the kind to watch Eva and imagine all the ways in which he'd do so much better than Shinji, how he'd save everyone, make the world a better place, and then inevitably hook up with whoever he deems to be best girl. Hayase strikes me as a Misato or Ritsuko guy. His existence screams mommy issues. In one fell swoop, he's given the chance to have it all, to be a hero. Before he even recognizes he has any new powers, he sees the chance to save this mysterious naked woman. He's so overtaken by that excitement that when he wakes up in a crater, after the robot falls on him, his clothes a bloody torn mess, his phone shattered, his curry bread under a rock, and the giant mech staring right at him, his first thought is not to get in contact with the police, or to go to the hospital, or even just get in touch with his friends, but to take this girl home so she can borrow his clothes. Yeah, smooth. To cut out some details which will only play into this essay a little bit later, Mecha attacked the city, his friend is nearly crushed by rubble, he discovers his powers, touches a booby, and summons the Linebarrel, immediately taking on his new role as a mecha pilot and fully fledged anime protagonist. In fact, his following actions find very simple reasoning in his mind. He has power, he's the hero, that means the things that face him are evil, and because they're evil, he'll beat them all. It doesn't matter how he came to have those powers, so long as he does. It doesn't matter what his friends think of him, so long as he can be the one in charge now. He lords his new strength over his old tormentors and flaunts how he no longer needs his friends or anyone else protecting him. But all of it, every single thing, is done for his own sake. He doesn't want to just save the world, he wants to get credit for it too. If there isn't a commotion, then what's the point? In his efforts to become a hero, he abandons his own empathy, his lofty ideals of justice, clearly just a front for his ambitions. the destruction of his own hometown as a result of his recklessness, and acceptable side effect of his grandeur. He's going to change except the moment he's faced with someone more capable, someone who has given the time and effort to hone his skills instead of just having his power fall into his lap, he falls flat on his face. He's completely and utterly defenseless, despite the bold words he'd been throwing around moments ago. It's over in seconds. And that alone isn't enough, as Hayase's failings lead to more than just destruction of property and personal embarrassment, and to him being despised by those he so dearly proclaimed he would protect, but to the death of the one person who had his back even when Hayase wanted nothing of the sorts. That is the turning point which fascinated me. Because of how insufferable Hayase had been at the start of the show, a lot of people completely abandoned it in just a few episodes. Myself included, the first time I gave the series a shot. It literally took me 3 whole attempts to actually sit through the entire anime, and to understand his character beyond just the surface level, and feel something more towards him than hate. Because Hayase is made to be hated, he's overly confident, reckless, self-important, and thick as a bag of rocks. The first 2 episodes exist as build-up towards one thing alone, for him to get what's coming to him. There's a reason to his weakness, for him being so utterly pathetic. He, like Shinji, is a teenager, already struggling to find his place in the world. He spends his days being bullied, and who comes to his aid each time? Well, the girl he's had a crush on, for one. Side note, she also has a thing for him, and I have no actual idea why. If there's a reason for Hayase to think he's a protagonist, it ought to be how every woman in this show has at least a vague romantic interest in him. But she doesn't come alone, because there's no better backup to be found than his old friend Yajima. As Hayase describes it himself, Yajima could never imagine the wretched feeling of being too weak to protect the person you loved, to have someone else come in and do it for you, and for that other person then to also say you every time. It was an arrangement that Yajima and their mutual crush Risako were entirely content with. An arrangement they want back, in fact, as even at the start of the show, Hayase's grown so miserable he's willing to endure all the bullying in the world just to avoid being saved by Yajima again and again. Envy festers inside him, a selfish desire for personal glory, which is why when this mysterious naked woman shows up next to him, he makes it a personal mission to rescue her, to provide her with shelter and clean clothes, and to help her recover her memories. And yet mere moments later, when the city is attacked by mechs, he's almost immediately shoved aside to a background role by his endlessly more heroic and charismatic friend. Yajima doesn't even really consider what's going on. He's so used to Hayase being powerless, he just assumes that he, and this new girl, need to be saved just as well. Again, it's reinforced when the rubble nearly crushes them all, only stopped by Yajima, ready to give up his life to save them. But just like that, for once, it's Hayase who doesn't let Yajima be the selfless hero. It's Hayase taking away Yajima's glory. And when it happens, it feels good. Hayase has power, and he's not letting anyone take it away from him, the way he'd felt it taken away by his friends as much as by his bullies. It doesn't matter how he got his strength, even though he is, by all accounts, already dead to have it. He declares instead that he's been born anew. The old Hayase is dead, and a new Hayase, one that can stand up for himself, has come into this world. He desperately wants just a bit of admiration, praise, anything, but in that bid for recognition, he becomes despicable. Pity, regret, hate, loathing, ridicule, annoyance, pettiness, schadenfreude, humiliation. These aren't just ways we feel about these characters. In large part, it's the way they feel about themselves. The way we might feel about ourselves too in our lowest points, times when nothing goes our way. Whether it's because of trauma or circumstance or our own undoing, sometimes things go wrong. In a moment of weakness, we could all fall into this pit of despair and self-hatred if nothing pulls us out, whether a friend or our own willpower. but it can be so very hard. Every helping hand that reaches out seems undeserved. Every success just another step towards new failures, and in your hand is a pen, or a pencil, or a brush, or most likely these days, a blank page on a document sits before you, the text cursor blinking slowly and rhythmically in and out of existence, waiting for you to make a move. Moments, or hours, or years later, you'll breathe life into a character, one with hopes and aspirations, joys and sorrows, personal tragedies and achievements, and failings, flaws. You've made your character human. Good work. Where do you go from here? What inspired this video in the first place was my fascination with Hayase. The bizarre choice of a character arc which left him detested by most watchers from episode 1. I'd dropped the series once before, watching only a couple of episodes on Crunchyroll before deciding it just wasn't for me. Not much credit to my teenage taste at the time though, since I'm fairly sure I moved on to watch SAO instead. Then, years later, I picked it up again in almost morbid curiosity, and was pleasantly surprised to see what the author had been going for all along. How they'd been building up towards Hayase's fall from grace without me having realized it somehow. It started to click for me after some time. It took 2 rewatches to actually get through the show, and it's alright. It's a very trope-heavy and kinda janky mecha show with wild set pieces, a silly plot, tacky character designs, and a lot of breasts going boobily, but it was fine, really. I'd fashioned myself as a writer since I was a young kid, and when I started to spot these parallels, I started to work on a video which could explore them. How this sort of pathetic protagonist archetype could be used by different authors to different ends. After all, my initial reading of Goodnight Punpun had not resonated with me at the time, not without hindsight. I'd have finished almost every chapter only to then scroll down to the comments and chuckle at all the people I saw discussing how relatable they found Punpun to be. I laughed because throughout most of the story I found him to be horrible. I recognized it was his trauma which caused him to act how he did, what brought on his anxieties, and yet I said aloud to myself how that didn't excuse his actions in the story, the mistakes he would make, the people he would hurt. But they didn't need to be excused. Our failures don't need excuses, they don't need explanations or rationalization, they need acknowledgement. When we hurt those we love around us, it's not a question of why, it's a question of what now? And the answer is atonement. Not for the sake of those hurt or lost, but for our own. While I was asking around for protagonists which fit the bill for this video, it was suggested to me that I should watch A Silent Voice. And I'm so glad I did, and I'll refuse to spoil the movie at all here. It's worth experiencing for yourself, almost ironically, to let the story speak for itself. Back when I finished Goodnight Punpun, I thought to myself that that wasn't enough, and he didn't learn, and most callously, he deserved worse. That he deserved harsher consequences for his actions, that it isn't right for him to be given another chance the way he was, over and over again. Isn't it? At what point can you claim someone to be a lost cause, that they can't come back? The end of Punpun's story is never told to us directly, and we're left to fill in the blanks ourselves. And if you took that pen and put it in my hands, I don't know what I would write, but I'd like to think he'd keep trying. Somehow, somewhere, in ways neither I nor Punpun knew yet, we'd figure it out on the way. With Hayase, his motivations seem selfish, he seems ignorant, and the fact is, it's true, but that doesn't mean he can't better himself, which he does. After all, nobody is perfect, even his good friend Yajima only ever really had his back because, well, he was crushing on the same girl. He was no champion of justice either. It's possible to lead a life which makes your course seem set in stone, a downward spiral with no way back out, or to make a single mistake so grand it sends you into a pit of despair. Maybe it's social anxiety, outside pressure, addiction, mental illness, trauma, or just being a dumb kid that doesn't know any better. There has to be a way back. It's not always a total 180, the thing to pull us out of our self-pity, or to take a character like this from a detestable one to one that's beloved, can be as simple as being given the chance at redemption. To better ourselves somehow, to try and undo what's been done, or to start by fixing ourselves, or in the most extreme case, to double and triple down in a way which can't help but earn respect.
This is how I win.
Even if doing so turns out to be the biggest possible mistake either way. In the end, I won't tell you how A Silent Voice ends, but I can tell you how it begins. Ishida Shoya tries to kill himself. He stops. And that is where his atonement begins.